This is the 6th webinars in the series Living Christianity Today, Loving Christianity Tomorrow, and we're delighted to welcome a wonderful panel of guests today and an important theme which will center around the topic of Jewish-Orthodox Christian Dialogue. We have 2 rabbis and an Orthodox priest as members of our guest panel today, and I offer you a warm welcome. As a short introduction, we have Rabbi Sybil Sheridan, a rabbi of the Newcastle Reform Synagogue and an executive director of the Lions Learning Project for Adult Education, which covers Jewish history, religious culture, and so on, present with us today. Sybil, you're most welcome. We have a Rabbi, Professor Nicholas Delange, who is a specialist in Byzantine Judaism and Jewish-Christian relations. He's a visiting rabbi of Etz Chaim Synagogue in Crete and a professor emeritus of Cambridge University. Nicholas, very warm welcome to you as well. And we have a Reverend Professor Andrew Louth, a professor emeritus of Durham University, an Orthodox priest in the north of England, and a specialist in Byzantine and patristic studies. Welcome, Father Andrew, and without any further ado, I will give Father Andrew a zoom of introduction, of bringing us into today's topic, and you're almost welcome to unmute yourself and start, Father.
I think I want to start with a bit of history, because Jewish-Orthodox relations is a huge topic, and we could spend a whole webinar talking on just one small aspect of it. But the idea, I think, of of having this webinar on Jewish-Orthodox relations in this context, I think it grows out of a colloquy that's existed for at least 30 years. I mean, I've been associated with it as long as that, and it was not, it didn't start with me. A colloquy that meets 2 or 3 times a year, now twice a year, that was inspired initially by, I don't know who actually, but a Jewish philanthropist who gave money to enable this to exist, to start off with. And his intuition was, I was told, that he felt that conversations between Jews and Orthodox would be more likely to find some sort of common ground and find some sort of fruitful discussion than discussions just between Jews and Western Christians. It was never made clear, to me at any rate, why this was thought to be the case. And I remember in the early meetings that we used to have in University College London with Raphael Lowy as the host, that quite often this sort of the question is, what is it that makes it even possibly fruitful for Jews and Orthodox to meet together? What is it that we have that's in common? Because on the face of it, there isn't anything very obviously in common. I mean, the Orthodox are the more Orthodox, to put it quite bluntly, the Orthodox are the Christian group among whom you're most likely to find anti-Jewish feeling. A lot of our texts are in fact anti-Jewish, particularly the texts for Holy Week. The texts relating to the trial and the passion of Christ are very free in condemning the Jews as those who were responsible for all of this. And no distinction is made in the text between the Jews who did it and the Jews who are their successors. Most other Christians in the West have faced this problem and found some way of solving it. But it seems to me that among the Orthodox, there are those who feel very deeply about it, but nothing very much has been done. But there seemed to me I remember one point that was often made was that, well, in some way, Jews in Europe and Orthodox in the West both have a very ambivalent attitude towards Enlightenment. Maybe ambivalent in different ways, but the way in which most Western Christians have come to terms with the Enlightenment and developed a form of Christianity that that embraces Enlightenment values has not really occurred, certainly not occurred in Orthodox Christianity. And there are certainly very strong movements within Judaism that have a similarly ambivalent attitude towards the idea that Enlightenment occurred in the 18th century, though many Jewish thinkers had a good deal to do with that. But one thing that struck me particularly, and so I throw it out as a possibility, is that the notion of diaspora is much more important, it seems to me, for Orthodox Christians in the West than it is for any other Christians in the West, most of whom have settled down in the West and don't really feel that they are, as it were, in the dispersion away from home, not really at home where they are. And two things. First of all, it seems to me that the notion of diaspora is a notion that is recurrent in what I know of Jewish thought. The idea that the Jews, for the last 2,000 years, at least for the last 2,000 years, have been people who have not been allowed to have their own home in the way they wanted it to be. And even before, even when there was even in the time of Christ, there were many Jews living away from Israel, and they were the result of earlier attempts to remove the Jews from their homeland, and there were groups in the Middle East and in Egypt particularly who lived in what they sometimes thought of as a state of exile from their homeland. And that also how do I put it? That also underlay a deeper sense that they were not really meant to be at home in this world, that there was that this world is not a place for us to be at home in. And early Christians certainly felt this very deeply. Second century Christians, there is this sense in many of them that they are in the world, but they are not of the world, that the idea of settling down politically in the world seemed completely impossible. And for many of them, this was something that was defining of this sort of third race, neither Hellenes nor Jews, who were in the world but didn't belong to it. I mean, the most famous of writings that asserts this is a writing that was unknown for hundreds and hundreds of years, the Epistle to Diognetus, where the author, who is anonymous, talks about Christians as being foreigners wherever they are and making themselves at home wherever they are, that they are not, they don't belong anywhere, but they are good citizens wherever they are. Now, the Christian experience of the last 2,000 years has, for most of us, been an experience of being part of something, being part of a kind of political entity called Christendom. And this is now in the past, but it is on the whole, but it is always there to be taken away from Christians. But I think the first group that began to live with the idea that they were not in their homeland and could never be in their homeland came about in the 20th century, partly as a result of the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, and also more immediately and sort of more vividly in the case of the Russians who found themselves expelled or in flight from the country which they held to be theirs. And certainly, as far as the Orthodox experience has been concerned, there seems to be two sides to it. One is there are those who felt that this experience of diaspora was a revelation, that Christians had become too much at home in the world, had become corrupted by the political power that they were able to wield, and that the discovery that they were no longer at home in the world, they were simply guests of the people among whom they lived, had a profound spiritual dimension that enabled them to think about what it was to be Christians, what it was to be a church, in a way that had not occurred for 1500 years. And for many of them, this was a liberation. Though there was often, even those who felt this, there was often the case, a sort of nostalgia for the immediate past, for the Holy Russia, for the onion domes, and for the sense of the church as defining the nature of the land. Now, it seems to me that one area where Jews and Orthodox might find it helpful to talk to one another is trying to unfold what is meant by this experience of being part of the diaspora, or part of a diaspora. Not able to think of themselves as fully at home in a world that is ruled by people who don't share their faith and their aspirations. And I just throw that out as an idea. I've tried to pursue it a bit myself, but mostly in reflection on how Christians understand their place in the world, in a world that is no longer, in any very sensible sense of the word Christian. And I don't think, I'm convinced, in fact, that a nostalgia for what has gone, for whatever reason it has gone, is not really a very helpful basis for trying to understand what it is to be Christians in the world today. And it strikes me, I have learned a lot from Jews, from their writings about the nature of this experience. I mean, in one sense, it seems to be, doesn't it, that diaspora can be an immensely creative experience, but for many people it is very different and very hard, and very alienating. That's my sort of exordium, and see where we can go. We don't have to go from there. There are lots of other things we can discuss, but it seems to me this is an area where there is enough, where there is, well, I feel there is likely to be enough common ground for us to be able to share our experiences with one another in a way that will be helpful to all of us.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Father Andrew. This is a very rich introduction, and developing the idea of a common ground a little bit further into our guest common ground. All of our 4 guests, including myself, are the members of the Jewish Christian Orthodox Dialogue group that meets in Cambridge regularly, and we've been experiencing it, some for decades and some for decades. I think all of us have this length of that experience, and this is our common place from which we're hoping to offer a 2-volume book on that experience and about that experience, but we can talk about it later. What is important to highlight from what Father Andrew just said is that, in a sense, Christianity and Orthodoxy could be at its best in exile, so to speak. And this is maybe the place where there is less of anti-Jewish sentiment and things of value flourish somehow in the situation. But I would like to ask Nicholas to give a response or a continuation, or whatever you feel, as an offering following Father Andrew's introduction into the topic. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Elena, and thank you for inviting me to take part in this event. I would like to make some comments on Father Andrew's remarks. But first of all, I'd like to say something about my understanding of encounter and dialogue between Judaism and Christianity. First of all, encounter means meeting. And the most important thing that we do in our group, and generally, I think, in Jewish and Christian encounter, is to meet each other. And meeting involves getting to know something which is profoundly different. And getting to know anybody is a challenge, I think. And getting to know people who are defined from the outset by being different from you is more of a challenge. You know, when we are born, we are, of course, we are learning about the world, but also we are immensely self-centered. And the first challenge facing a baby is really to learn how to be a little bit more considerate and a bit more interested in other people around, because otherwise one is entirely obsessed by one's own needs and one's own rights, if I can put it like that. And as we grow up and go through life, we have a tendency sometimes to be very self-centered. And this applies to religions as much as it applies to individuals and other groups. And dialogue is very different from debate, and it's very different from study. All the members of our group are either Jews or Orthodox Christians, and sometimes we've had suggestions that so-and-so should join such and such a professor something because he's such a great expert on the early church or the history of Judaism or something. And we have to say, no, we are not a study group. We exist for the purpose of dialogue. And dialogue, as I say, is different from debate because we're not confrontational. In debate, we're scoring points, and we are there to learn and listen. So I think encounter and dialogue really go together. And the task that we have is to broaden our understanding through meeting something which is different and like us. I always like it. It says, you know very well that it says in the Bible, both in the Old Testament and in the New Testament, I think that you should love your neighbor like you. And the commentators sometimes say that the Hebrew text means because he's like you. But I always think, actually, it's meeting the neighbor who is not like you, which is the real challenge. And it starts by acknowledging that he is like you because we are made in the image of God, if you believe in the theology of that, and the common humanity which joins us is a starting point. But then we focus on the differences, and that's where we learn more. I have learned more about Judaism through talking to Christians than I think than I ever have probably from learning from ordinary Jews that I meet. I'm not talking about my teachers, to whom I have a great debt. Common ground. So that's a lot of the common ground, common humanity, the fact that we live in the world, the fact that we are like human beings, I think in a very old understanding, are poised somewhere between heaven and earth. The ancient rabbis say that human beings have something of the characters of the upper beings and something of the character of the lower beings. They mean, like angels, we walk upright and praise God, and like the animals, we have certain bodily functions and needs and so on. We are somewhere in between. That's where we belong, somewhere between heaven and earth. And I think Jews and Christians are both in this position. And I have learned so much from hearing Christians talking about, for example, Jesus Christ. I said I wouldn't talk about Jesus Christ, but one thing about Jesus Christ is he is suspended between heaven and earth as I see him on the cross. And I think that's such a poignant, moving and thought-provoking position to be in, to be reaching up and yet having one's feet somehow on the ground. So that's by way of an introduction about me and my ideas. About enlightenment, I think that's a very good point that Father Andrew made, but you have to understand that historically, what most Jews in Britain today know as Judaism was created out of the Enlightenment and didn't exist before. This is true of all the denominations, of all the sort of synagogues that you're likely to enter if you're not Jewish. For example, Orthodox, Reform, Masorti, Liberal, and so on. They all in different ways and to different measures arise out of the experience of the Enlightenment, which brought with it for Jews civil rights in Western European and West Central European countries, and a recognition and an engagement with the thought and the life of the people around them. And so there is a very, very close connection for Western Jews between Enlightenment and civil rights and cultural acculturation, if you like, even assimilation, which is a bit of a dirty word for Jews, but there is a sort of assimilation to the society around us. And what this excludes, the people this includes, are the people who turned their back on the Enlightenment, who turned their back on the modern developments, and chose to rebuild the ghetto walls around them in a voluntary way. And these people, you may know of as Hasidim and so on, the press and the media love them because they're so photogenic and they have such wonderfully extreme and antiquated Jews. And I think actually there is room for a big debate, which never seems to happen, between Enlightenment Jews and non-Enlightenment Jews, if you like. So Jews are divided. Jews are also divided, and this is very important, I think, for me, ministering as I do to a community of Jews and indeed non-Jews in Crete. Jews are divided between Western Jews and Eastern Jews nowadays. We used to say between Sephardim, Spanish and Portuguese Jews, and Ashkenazim, German and Polish Jews, but actually nowadays Spanish and Portuguese really includes Jews from the Middle Eastern origin and North African origin. And now the encounter with Orthodoxy bridges that gap, because Orthodox Jews traditional Jews very often come either out of Russia or Poland, Eastern Poland, which was absorbed into Russia in the 18th century, or from the Middle East, or from Orthodox countries in Southeast Europe. So countries where traditional Christianity is very often of an Orthodox hue. And so we embrace, in our group, we talk about Russian Christianity and Greek Christianity as if it were the same thing. I don't think it is, probably, if you experience it, but that's how we treat it. And we treat Jews as well, all as a single group. But I think we are helped to come to terms with some of the differences. I could say things about Diaspora. There's a lot to say about Diaspora, but I think it's time for me to stop and hand on to someone else.
Thank you very much, Nicholas. Thank you for this follow-up and bringing it to new levels, talking about the challenges of the dialogue, and specifically about the tendency of being self-centered religiously, which Jews and Christians share. And there is more that we share, the common ground, the challenge of being divided. We as Christians are very divided, and Jews are very divided as well. And often the challenge of talking to a member of your own religious tradition is more challenging than finding the common ground between a member of a different religious tradition. And that is a huge challenge of a dialogue that we are failing to establish amongst ourselves, and that we can work together in learning how to do it. I would like to give the Zoom to Sybil Sheridan, who is also a member of our group, and maybe you can follow from what has been said, or maybe emphasize something that struck you in particular. Thank you, Sybil.
Well, I'd certainly like to pick up on what you've just said, Elena, because I have been a member of many, many dialogue groups through my life. I was the first non-Christian to study theology at Cambridge University. And so my entire experience there was one in dialogue, because all my contemporaries, except for one other Jew who was there at the same time, were all Christian. So that almost every time I opened my mouth, it was a matter of either explaining or understanding, or or the like. it's very clear that, again, having been to many, many conferences, that what happens is when you have an encounter with people of another faith, you can learn so much and be so inspired. But the real challenge is when you go back to your own community, trying to explain what happened. And that's a sort of secondary point, which I found over and over again is a very difficult thing to do. It really is important, therefore, that people meet firsthand. As Nicholas said, it's the encounter. It's not necessarily what is being said, but it's the fact that you are talking and listening to each other that can actually change the aspects of what you're doing. I wanted to pick up also on the idea of diaspora. Certainly, Judaism was created in diaspora. Rabbinic Judaism, okay, was founded in the land of Israel, but at a time when the Roman rule was dominant. And so much of Judaism was defined in opposition to the ruling authorities of Rome. But then the second great flowering of our literature, the creation of the Talmud, happened in Babylon, the Babylonian Talmud, which is the core, really, of our theology. And so, whereas we owe our common origins and roots, as does Christianity in the Old Testament, the way we have become Jewish as opposed to Judeans, really owes the fact that we have been without control in our own land and without our land. And I think that certainly, it really resonated with me, what Andrew said, therefore, that, living in a post-Christian world, in a way, Christians are in the same position, in that there's this sense of rootlessness. But I think historically what Judaism has shown is that is a period of enormous creativity, because that's how you define yourself. When you're living in a country, you don't have to work out what it means to be British, because you are, if you're living there. If you're living in exile, you're constantly having to work out who you are and where you are in opposition to other people. And my sense of the development of anti-Semitism, in a sense, comes from that sort of sense also, that both Jews and Christians actually have defined themselves in opposition to each other. From the Christian perspective, it's certainly very much through, the whole passion narrative, which, in Jewish terms, I think we could talk about as a midrash. It's an interpretation. In this sense, it's an interpretation of the Exodus experience, which is translated into the suffering, the passion, and the crucifixion. For the Jewish perspective, as a minority living largely in Christian lands, Judaism developed in opposition to the ruling authority, which was Christianity. So what we're faced with today are texts which are in some senses opposed to each other, and that what we need to do is to examine those texts together to come to an understanding that takes away that kind of oppositional effect, in order that we can totally understand and encounter, and that way one hopes, remove the sort of inherent anti-Judaism and anti-Christianity that does appear within Judaism. I just wanted to end with, if I may, if I have time, with two midrashim which always fascinate me. Very often, it's much easier to love people who are far away than it is to love people close to. Tensions within a family are much more important and can be much more violent than tensions outside with strangers or relative strangers. And very often in a dialogue context, the stories of Jacob and Esau are brought in. Two brothers who had very good reasons to hate each other, who come together at the end. There is an encounter where they kiss each other and they weep. Now, there are different ways of interpreting this. There's a Jewish understanding that this was actually fake, and the weeping was essentially because there was no real reconciliation. Although we do know that the two brothers came together in the end to bury Isaac. So there is a sort of ambivalence there as to whether after a lifetime of hatred, they actually came together. But there is another model, which is the one that I prefer, which is of Rachel and Leah, two sisters who also had a very difficult relationship with each other because married to the same man who had an obvious preference for the one over the other. Both had their own personal tragedies. But there is a midrash, again, a rabbinic interpretation, which suggests that in heaven, after the exile of the people and the destruction of Jerusalem, Rachel confronted God and challenged God and said, "You cannot leave the people without hope. I have sacrificed everything for my sister. I knew that when Laban was going to substitute my sister and trick Jacob into marrying her, I knew this was going to happen, and I could have warned Jacob, but I did not want to shame my sister. And so I held back. In fact, I told her, Jacob and I had secret signs we were going to show each other so that we knew that he would know that it was me, Rachel, and not Leah. I told those signs to my sister so she would not be shamed." It's an example of sacrifice, of holding oneself back in order for the greater good of other people. And I think within dialogue, this is something that we have to do. There's always a temptation. We have to put our point of view forward for the other person. But in real dialogue, what you're doing is holding back and allowing the other person to come to you. And it's that kind of holding back, that withholding, that sacrifice that can bring a true reconciliation.
Thank you. It was a true inspiration, and I hope we can enhance that discovery, that journey that we're going through together. And especially, I want to emphasize what you mentioned, Sybil, about redefining oneself, redefining one's identity, redefining one's religion. And there is another common ground between Judaism and Orthodox Christianity. Both religions project itself as a living tradition, and it's a highly charged concept, which means that it has to redefine itself continuously against all odds, against the hostility of the world, if you want, or anything, against every generation, because every following generation cannot afford to take the living tradition for granted. Then it stops being a living tradition. And in that sense, there is an incredible commonality of ground here. And another thing that you said is about redefining oneself against the other. And that is perhaps how both Judaism and Christianity started their living tradition. But the tendency is not to depart from the infantile state of being self-centered and hostile, constantly redefining oneself against the other, but grow out of it in the next stage of appreciation of the other and learning to communicate with the other, learning to have that meeting place with the other based in the common humanity, as Nicholas mentioned. And I want to give the ball, so to speak, into the Nicholas corner again, and perhaps you can talk a little bit more on those aspects that Sybil and I highlighted. Thank you, Nicholas.
Where to begin? There's so much. There's such a rich conversation. I suppose I could say something about diaspora, dispersion, which, like so many words that we use in Judaism, is a Greek word. I don't know why. You know, I studied classics, and when we were preparing for this, you asked me, Elena, how I got involved in Jewish and Orthodox Christian Dialogue, and I studied classics at Oxford. So therefore I learned Greek, and I ended up eventually doing research on a Greek father of the Greek Church, thanks to probably having encountered Orthodox Christians at Oxford, where they were a very social lot, and you couldn't really have a social life without going to Canterbury Road and going to the Dr. Zenos garden parties, and then little by little discovering the spiritual richness of the music and so on of the Orthodox Church. It was a very, very deep and wonderful experience for me. I've started a sentence which has got too long, and I can't remember where it was going to go. But anyway, so that's how I began, and I gradually got drawn into this encounter with Orthodox Christians. I didn't have a very strong feeling of diaspora. I felt, on the contrary, that Christians, especially Orthodox Christians, seemed very rooted. You know, I had Armenian Orthodox friends who talked about diaspora morning, noon, and evening. It was clearly diaspora was what shaped their consciousness as Armenians living outside Armenia. But I didn't find that with the Russians I met in Oxford or in Paris, even though obviously they were just as much in exile, a recent exile. But the Jewish experience of diaspora is a much more subtle and complicated thing than you could imagine. The English novelist, Jewish novelist Israel Zangwill said once that the Spanish and Portuguese Jews in London planted orange trees in the courtyard of their synagogue, not to remind them of the Holy Land, but to remind them of Spain and Portugal, where they'd come from. We have secondary or subsidiary diasporas, and diaspora is not one. It's not one thing. It's a mistake to simplify it. Diaspora, the feeling of exile is something which has been very, very deep in me. I can remember as a teenager and as a student in moments of alienation from the world or from the society I was in moments when I felt lonely or betrayed or simply a bit lost. This was the feeling that came to the fore, this feeling of exile. And I gradually came to realize that it wasn't something that actually defined being Jewish. I think it's a very human thing. But it's something that Judaism seizes on, because we have a whole festival, the festival of Sukkot, where we actually live in these little pathetic little huts, which originated in little frameworks with boughs of palm trees put on top of them for shade from the sun during the harvest. But we see them as a reminder that our life in this world is just a transient, fleeting sort of thing, or a sort of caravan, a movement, passing through. We're always passing through and never kind of getting there. I think personally, this is where a lot of the talk about the land of Israel makes a mistake. The land of Israel is our homeland, and homeland is a terribly important concept, and we love our homeland. We cherish our homeland, but our homeland, the land of Israel as a homeland, is only a symbol of a deeper homeland, which I think Father Andrew referred to. Our homeland is somewhere else. We will one day go home. I hope I will go home and discover my real homeland, but my homeland is not in the city of Jerusalem or in the confines of the land of Israel today. It's something much, much more, if you like, spiritual. I'm wary of the word spiritual. Talking to Orthodox Christians has made me very wary of the word spiritual, because the word spiritual is a word that comes to the fore a lot in our discussions. And I think the Jews feel that the Christians are very spiritual, meaning the Jews are more kind of earthy and so on. And I'm not sure about that. But have I said enough about that? There's a lot more one could say about diaspora. So I think that diaspora is not what makes me a Jew, though of course, in a sense, I can't help feeling that I'm in a diaspora being a Jew. But being a Jew helps me to have more of a sense of direction, of dispersion, of exile, of what to do about the feeling of exile and how to make it something that gives me comfort rather than anguish.
Thank you very much, Nicholas. Exploring into the commonalities of life in diaspora, I found another incredibly powerful and a common place which we share when Sybil started bringing midrashim, Jewish biblical exegesis, parables, didactics of the living tradition to our attention. And for me personally, midrash and the biblical exegesis was an incredible inspiration, as much as on the personal level as it is on professional level. I dedicated many years studying Jewish midrashim and comparing it with Jewish and Christian patristic biblical exegesis. And then the ideas float, and they don't harm each other, they enhance each other. They are not at odds with each other. They are bringing to light the biblical text, but with it, they bring to light the relationship between divine initiative and human response to it. Exactly the two main ingredients of the living religious tradition. So I want to address this question, or rather ask Sybil to comment further about offering exegesis of Jewish-Christian dialogue or Jewish-Christian response to divine initiative in now. Surely we have some sort of communication from God in the current realities. We have common challenges of diaspora and redefining ourselves. So there could be a commonality of the message that God addresses to the chosen people and to the Christians. What do you think about that common message from God that maybe we're missing as both communities?
Oh my goodness, that is quite a challenge. I mean, I think maybe in a sense, if I can go back to the idea of the diaspora, I think there is something in that. Building on what Nicholas said, I think there are two distinctive terms. Diaspora is, as you say, is the Greek word. In Hebrew, the word is galut, which means exile. And they are different. Diaspora often means people have left, but maybe not through any fault of their, not through their own volition, but they can sometimes choose to stay. Whereas with exile, there is no possibility of return. And I think that historically we found that. I mean, after the Babylonian exile, the majority of the dispersed stayed in Babylon because there was a thriving Babylonian Jewish community that existed in parallel to the community that was established during the Second Temple. And equally, I mean, this happens to this day. I spend quite a lot of time in Ethiopia with the Jewish community there. And they are desperate to go to Israel. And in a sense, it's in the gift of the Israeli government, and there's all sorts of politics involved, and it's taking years for them to go, and they've been promised, and then it doesn't happen, and it's really complicated. And they have said to me on many occasions, you can go and live in Israel. Why don't you? And it's almost impossible to answer that, because yes, I could, and I don't want to. And they can't understand that, because for them, Israel is that spiritual home. Whereas I think that we are too spoilt. But for us, the Israel that we yearn for is not the Israel that we have. There's always been an earthly Jerusalem and a spiritual and a heavenly Jerusalem, and I think this is something we share, with Orthodox Christianity too. And we aspire for the heavenly Jerusalem. So in a sense, we are in diaspora. We are not in exile in that sense. And I just wonder when you ask about, what is it that God is trying to teach us? I mean, I think that we are in the same, my understanding, in a sense, Orthodox Christians are in a similar situation. Where we are is not home. The home that we search for is not where we were, but it's some kind of perfected ideal of where we were. So that what we're striving for is something that is not of this world, but it is something that we can strive for together. And just one more thing that strikes me about this, in this religious notion that we have of galut, of exile, there is a very powerful image with the destruction of Jerusalem, of God's presence, the form of the Shekhinah, the divine presence, which is part of, in the mystical tradition, God, there are many emanations from God, from the Ein Sof, the sort of unknowable, all-encompassing God, to a form of the Godhead to whom we can relate. And this is described as the Shekhinah, the divine presence. This is the part of God that we can relate to and who embraces us and folds us, and is described in the form of usually as of a woman. It's a feminine concept. And the idea is that the Shekhinah chose to go into exile with the people of Israel. And so in a sense, separated, part of God separated from the wholeness of God in order to cherish and comfort and be present with the people in their exile. And part of the mystical understanding, of course, is that as we strive to return to the world as it should be, to the heavenly Jerusalem or the perfected Jerusalem, so the Shekhinah, the divine presence, yearns and will be restored to the rest of the Godhead. So that what we're doing is living in a fractured world at the moment, but that, through our actions, through our prayers, we are all striving for that reunification, that reconciliation. And I think that is also something that has its echoes within Orthodox Christianity.
Thank you very much. So we keep reliving the memory of the lost paradise, so to speak. We keep lament for a homeland which we never had, through lost generation being in exile. And what you mentioned is no return. There is probably no return to that paradise which we lost. Even that is taken away. And it was interesting when we're developing the thought of exile, and it almost feels like it's divinely providential for the well-being, for the spiritual well-being of human beings, to be deprived of something that we have tendency to familiarize ourselves with and make lots of mistakes. When we are too comfortable with the epicenter of our religion, be it Jerusalem or Moscow, or as a second Rome, or the fourth Rome, or Constantinople, or any other religious epicenter, that becomes prohibitive for the living tradition to breathe and flourish. Hence, we go in exile and redefine ourselves there. But literally, we're redefining our God. We're understanding that God is not in bricks, but in hearts. And this is an interesting about loss of homeland and forgetting the heaven and longing for it. And what, Nicholas, you mentioned, this longing and this desire. So maybe you could elaborate further or share with us further thoughts on the matter, please.
Well, I suppose it boils down to one four-letter word, love. We don't have a creed in Judaism, but the closest we have to a creed is the words of Deuteronomy, which you could translate as listen or be attentive or be sensitive, Jews. The Lord your God is one Lord, and you shall love. It goes on to say that you shall love the Lord your God. We say this every day. We say it twice a day, in the morning and in the evening, and it's really the deepest thing, deepest mystery. I wouldn't describe myself exactly as a Sufi, although there was a school of Jewish Sufism in the 12th, 13th centuries, but I'm very attached to to some of the Sufi poets who begin from the fact that God cannot be known, which you mentioned, and which Sybil mentioned in the Ein Sof, the infinite, which is in the Kabbalah is the totally unknowable kind of nucleus of God. You have to start from the unknowability of God to begin to attach yourself to it, or him or her, or I don't know the right pronoun, but how can we know? Because we can only talk about God in metaphors, and our language can't accommodate. We haven't got a pronoun for something which is completely unknowable. But we have these two commandments: love your neighbor and love God, and as you know, they are held in some kind of suspense with each other. And I do believe that it's through knowing people that we get a lot of our inklings. This is where I'm one with Hafiz and the other Sufi poets. We get inklings of what God could be like, but at the same time we have to acknowledge that they are totally imperfect. Images. There's a beautiful hymn which is sung at the end of some synagogue services in some synagogues, which is called the Song of the Glory, which is a mystical song from the I think 12th century, which talks about the fact that throughout the Bible God is spoken of in images, but the images are totally contradictory. For example, he could be described as a great warrior going into battle, and at the same time he could be described as the elder of days, which you imagine as a kind of somebody with an infinitely long grey beard and full of wisdom. And so how can you reconcile these images? Well, the fact is you have to, it's a reminder that whatever images you use about God are completely inadequate. And so we're all engaged on a search. I really believe that I'm sorry for people who reject God in their hearts, because I think they have perhaps it's presumptuous of me to say this, what they think, but I think they have a perhaps rather simplistic image of what God means to humans and to the world and so on. It's God for me as a quest. And that's what love of God means, I think. Not the kind of love where you feel you know the other person and you just embrace it and say, right, I love you because you are what you are, this and that. Here's a catalogue of 13 wonderful things about you. We don't actually have that list. We're called on to love something that we don't actually know, and that is what reduces us to searchers, people who quest. We are involved in a quest, and that is actually where the dialogue with Christianity, and with Orthodox Christianity in particular, to me it's a hugely important part of the quest, because it enriches, it gives me more clues. When I hear Orthodox Christians talking about their faith, it constantly drops little hints, which sometimes are like seeds which flower in my mind sooner or later.
Indeed, and thank you for bringing this four-letter word into the conversation, which popped up a few times in our webinars. And I think for an Orthodox Christian, the uttermost definition of God is love. And this is another expanding Orthodox Christian and Jewish understanding into humanitarian experience. We all experience love adequately or inadequately, and in that sense we've all experienced God. We all long for love, and perhaps this is our longing for the divine, and this common knowledge of love, a common experience of love, and prioritizing love as one of the uttermost divine attributes in Orthodox Christianity, and to some capacity in Judaism as well, expands and transcends the reality of the dialogue into the experience of it, and largely the experience of the divine. So before we wrap up, I will give a word to Sybil, and I would encourage our people from the audience, if you have questions, we will be happy to accept live questions for a short while. If not, we will wrap up and perhaps announce our coming book and possibly a launch of that book in the future. But Sybil, if you want to give a concluding remark to this meeting.
Well, I would certainly totally concur with what Nicholas was saying. And in that passage in Deuteronomy, where it says you shall love the eternal your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your strength, it goes on then to say you shall teach it to your children, and you shall talk about it. You shall talk about it all the time, it seems, when you sit in your house, when you walk by the way, when you lie down, when you rise up. It strikes me that's what we're doing, and that's what we should be doing. We should be talking about it. That's what dialogue is. That's very much what we're doing today. I'm going to stop there because I want to thank you, Elena, for introducing us to this really fascinating forum, and I've thoroughly enjoyed it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Nicholas, if you have something as a concluding remark from you, you're most welcome.
No, I think that Sybil has said it all, and I certainly want to reiterate her thanks. Thank you for this opportunity to engage.
And thank you very much for our guest panelist. Father Andrew unfortunately had to depart earlier for urgent reasons. But thank you for being with us. And this 6th webinar concludes our series of pilot webinars of this year. We started with icons and producing icon images. We followed on into religious identity and the challenges of it in religious calendar, and we carried on talking about human sexuality and women ministry and position of women in the church. The challenges of modernity was the last webinar, and this one is the webinar of love, the ultimate interaction between us as the followers of religion and with our God as our inspiration and hope, our guide. And it was a very inspirational meeting, and I thank you very much. We had a feedback from people thanking us, an absolutely fascinating discussion. That's the feedback, and indeed it was one of the most fascinating experiences for which I thank you being part of, and I wish you all the best. And with these words of huge gratitude, I will conclude the webinar, and keep your eyes open for the book that we're producing in the future, where we'll bring and tackle a lot of the topics that I've talked in those webinars. And we might even have a launch of this book within this wonderful space. So thank you once again, and all the best wishes. Bye-bye.